In terms of the presentation, these are draft findings. This is not the final conclusions of the independent working group. We have quite deliberately wanted to go out and present our findings and get further feedback. It's all about consultation. We accept it's short and sharp consultation because we have been through a significant consultation exercise, but we want to share the findings that we have and give people the opportunity. And you can either give that feedback during the course of this presentation or at the end, and you will be able to email Sue in terms of the specific comments you might wish to raise. Just firstly, we'd like to just make it clear that we think the timing of this is a little bit unfortunate given the preparations for the Olympics in London. I know Mark has met with the team of athletes yesterday so that he could advise them of what we are presenting around the country, but it is our plea as the working group that everybody supports and respects the effort that those athletes are making in preparation for London. We're all Kiwis, whether we're part of swimming or not. We want to see as many medals as possible. It's fantastic that you've got the biggest team that you've ever sent to the Olympics, and we really don't want to do anything to undermine those efforts and that achievement. In terms of the impetus for the review, originally in 2011 there was disagreement within the Swimming New Zealand membership regarding the governance and delivery which was negatively impacting the sport. This led to Swimming New Zealand, on behalf of the members, inviting Sport New Zealand, formerly Spark, to facilitate this review. And as a consequence, we were appointed as an independent group to do that. The goal of the review was to identify a sustainable organisation for Swimming New Zealand and swimming in New Zealand. The Independent Review Committee is myself as chair, Peter Fitzsimmons. Peter, would you mind standing up so that everybody can see you? Ian Hunt, who's also here. Susan Patterson, who is not here. Clive Power. Clive, you're at the back there. Simon Perry, also not here. Wayne Rollinson is here. Thanks, Wayne. And Teresa Stanley. Somewhere, Teresa? Yeah, great. And Sue Suckling, who will present to you. Sue's the one that's done all the heavy lifting and the hard work on behalf of the working group. In addition, there has been a steering committee. That steering committee has had nothing to do with the recommendations. The recommendations are solely the responsibility of the independent working group, who I've just introduced you to. That steering group was essentially for the purposes, for want of a better word, rations and discipline. So organising this meeting, organising our colleague here who's filming this presentation. The members of that committee were Ross Butler as Chairman of Swimming New Zealand, Jim Swanson representing the remainder of swimming, Bill Burney, who is a board member of Sport New Zealand, and Peter Miskimmon, the CEO of Sport New Zealand. Under the terms of reference, the purpose of the review was to resolve the clarity of purpose for Swimming New Zealand, a functional good practice pathway embracing all swimmers, including swimmers, coaches and officials, an appropriate role for Swimming New Zealand regarding Learn to Swim, contribution by Swimming New Zealand to the growth of swimming as a recreation and sport, and to position Swimming New Zealand as a lead organisation that people choose to be associated with. The terms of reference further went on to say that we should do a full review, or a review of the full landscape of swimming and the relationship with Swimming New Zealand, which would include governance, including constitutions for Swimming New Zealand, regions and clubs, board policy, strategic planning, board membership, links to organisational performance. Also, the organisation's structure and performance of Swimming New Zealand, its financial sustainability and relationships between the constituent parts within Swimming New Zealand and externally. We were asked to look at the findings of the Einison Review into High Performance and the recent Isaac Review in respect of water safety. We were also asked to look at the capability development of clubs, regions and related organisations, including coaches, volunteers and officials. The membership model and how this relates to governance and the operating model were also there, and also to look at comparable processes in other sports. The review methodology, as you're aware, this was publicly announced and has been known for some months. We have researched the history, context of the sport. We've spoken with Swimming Australia, and we've spoken with other sports which have undergone change. Sue has been integrally involved in a number of change processes within other sports. In talking to Swimming Australia, we did so after we had come to our conclusions, and it was interesting that their views corroborated where we had got to. We don't want to do things just because the Australians do it, but it was interesting to note that after we'd come to our conclusions, they were of a quite similar disposition in mind. We've reviewed documentation, including previous reviews, of which there have been a number. We've had meetings with Swimming New Zealand board and staff. There have been written submissions using a questionnaire from more than 50 people, and we've had face-to-face meetings again with more than 50 people, with key internal and external stakeholders, regions, clubs, athletes, sponsors, coaches, administrators, right across the board. And I'd like to thank everybody who did make a written submission and or met with us, because there was some really good material that was put in front of us, and a lot of people put a lot of time into those submissions. And as required, we also met with Chris Einison and Alec and Isaac in respect of their reviews. As part of the process, we also identified best practice, tried to identify and analyse the gaps in the sport, and develop recommendations to address those gaps. So what did we find? Well, we found absolutely passionate, committed people who are absolutely trying to do the best for the sport. And despite the fact that we will make some criticisms, we know that everybody in the sport and in this room, the board of Swimming New Zealand, the staff of Swimming New Zealand, are all good people trying to do a really good job. There is nothing in this that is trying to say they are bad people. Everybody strives to do a good job. You've got a wonderful, large, engaged, willing volunteer base supporting competitions. And coming from the sports I've been involved in, my eyes were really open to the number of volunteers that you have around pools during competitions, and just the dedication and commitment of those volunteers. Quite spectacular. Great quality technical capability, excellence in running competitions, and Swimming New Zealand deserves real credit for that. Generally positive financial resources in regions and clubs, not all, but pretty good when you look at other sports, just how well clubs and regions, the position they're in financially, and that's a real credit. We found an alumni wanting to give back to the sport and make a difference. Really keen to support the sport that they say gave them so much, not just as a sport, but in terms of life skills and opportunities. Obviously, again, run by Swimming New Zealand, an excellent annual sports award event, which celebrates success. We also found the sport wanting review implementation. As you know, there have been several reviews over the years. Most of them have not been implemented, or if they have been, in part only. So even as an act of faith before we went forward with our recommendations, without knowing what was in it, everybody was saying to us, we must implement the outcomes of this review. We found a sport with 6,000 competitive swimmers, despite being the largest New Zealand recreation sport if you take pools, rivers, lakes, the ocean. Huge number of people involved and a real opportunity to try and grow that competitive swimmer space. And finally, as we've already touched on, the largest Olympic qualifying team in the history of the sport. But inevitably there are the buts. And the buts are that we found poor leadership from Swimming New Zealand and the regions. Now, if you read the media, it would read poor leadership from Swimming New Zealand. Let me make it absolutely clear. It is poor leadership from Swimming New Zealand and the regions. Takes two to tango. It is not simply about pointing the finger, and we'll come to pointing the finger, at Swimming New Zealand. The regions must take an equal amount of responsibility. Maybe not all regions, but there are a bunch of them that are just as accountable in this area. There is no shared vision for the sport and the role of Swimming New Zealand. Again, this is not a criticism of Swimming New Zealand, it's a criticism of the whole sport. The whole sport has to have a shared vision. There is a dysfunctional relationship between some regions and Swimming New Zealand. And I think if anybody denies that, they really have put their head in the sand. There are ineffective, formal, two-way linkages and alignment between Swimming New Zealand, regions and clubs. And we'll discuss that further. There are linkages, but they're not as formal and as in place and as robust as we think is necessary for a sport to be right at the top of the pyramid. We believe there are too many regions. You read that in the media? No. We believe there are too many regions, and that impacts competition quality and also the amount of resources that are being ploughed into some areas. We will come back to recommendations on that. In our view, there's no collective responsibility in the sport, not in Swimming New Zealand, in the sport, to find solutions. And instead, there's a lot of finger pointing. And the finger pointing is at individuals, as opposed to saying, I'm going to point my finger at what I think the problem is, and I'm now going to talk about the solution. Instead, it's, she said this, he said that. And it's almost as if opinions and views are dismissed based on the person who said it, not on the integrity or logic of their arguments. And that leads to this culture of mistrust and playing the person, not the ball. There are broken relationships everywhere, which is just consistent with everything I've been going through, both personal, within the swimming fraternity, externally, commercially, etc. And there are other buts. We found a lack of fundamentals required to support and grow a sport. Most of you here will know about the arguments over the database. Look, that's just a given, and we will come to that as a recommendation later on. We think that the sport has done outstandingly well, but we think there's a place for better coach development and club development. We think there is the potential for loss of sponsorship, given the direction of travel we're going. All of these factors do affect what sponsors think. We believe that we have a sport that is somewhat blinkered to the present. Not the past, although there's elements of that. People are always telling war stories about the past, but blinkered to the present in the sense of not really putting arms around, not really working with commercial providers. And kids have so many choices nowadays, not just in sport, but in so many other walks of life. And so we think the sport needs to be a lot more forward-looking, a lot more engaging outwardly, both with other external providers and about its opportunities. I said earlier you've got a wonderful alumni. I mean, some of the alumni that came to see us from Dandenong to Down all talked about how they want to give to the sport, but they feel underutilised. They just don't feel they're being asked to come in and contribute. Now again, Swimming New Zealand, regions, clubs, whatever, it's across the sport. It's not just one organisation. I think most would understand and know there is a lack of clarity on who should be the members of Swimming New Zealand. Indeed, there have been some wars, in inverted commas, around signing up members to get more votes. That's a regions issue. That's not Swimming New Zealand. And like many sports, particularly in New Zealand, the constitution is ambiguous and out of date. In terms of operational performance, we found that there's no whole of sport strategic plan, and we believe that is critical to trying to link everything together, and we do think Swimming New Zealand needs to lead that. There's been a lot of talk about facilities. Project Vanguard identified that it was one of two key issues. We don't believe that enough work has been done on a formal facility strategy. Some work has been done, not saying it hasn't, but we don't think sufficient work. No sustainable programs for mentoring and development of coaches, even though that's been a really successful area. We don't think the approach to HB delivery has been as clear and transparent as it should be, and we think some steps can be made in that regard. There's clearly been poor project implementation and execution. The database is an example, Vanguard is another example, and the past reviews haven't been implemented. We think there's poor communication and transparency from Swimming New Zealand to the sport, but just as importantly, the sport back to Swimming New Zealand. And we think there's been an inconsistent delivery of the sport across New Zealand, whereby the best don't swim against the best as much as we believe is desirable and necessary. So the general feedback, if we try and summarise it all together, is that there was strong agreement on what the issues are, but varying views on solutions. And to be honest, most people didn't venture any solutions. They were great at defining the problems, great at defining that it was someone else's problem, but not a lot of proactive, positive solutions. A large number of people we saw question whether anything will change as a result of this review because it hasn't happened in the past, and why is this one going to be any different? And finally, there are people, quite a large body, who are sick of the dysfunction in politics across the whole sport, and they've just decided to get on and do their own thing. And I know it says despite SNZ in commas because that was what was said in a couple of occasions, but it's actually the whole sport again. In terms of all this, we looked at other sports, talked about Swimming Australia, which focuses on competitive swimming. Reformed sports have governance processes that they have revised and getting the right people with the right skills. The May report identified that there's no single solution that fits all sports. The clarity of purpose of an organisation is absolutely critical and fundamental. That future structures must cater for traditional membership plus new types of membership. Regional differences are marked across New Zealand, and organisational leadership, board, chair, CEO, is critical. So the overall conclusion is that Swimming New Zealand is currently adding very little value outside of running the national competitions and elite HP. It has lost the respect and